Okay, great. So I'm starting the recording. And for those of you who are listening to the recording, I've just introduced Matt Broussard. I forgot to start the recording, but this is Matt Broussard from Ground News, who's the head of growth and partnerships, here to present to us how we can use Ground News to help our work in the field. So Matt, I will turn it over to you.
Hey everyone, thank you for being here on this lovely Tuesday. I've been involved with Brave Angels for about a bit over a year now. I had the privilege of attending last year's conference in Gettysburg. I'm actually from Canada. I'm currently in Toronto, Ontario. So it was really kind of great to see kind of the history of the nation and all these folks from different divides in one space. And I'll also be at this year's convention in Kenosha. So if you want to talk more at the convention, talk more about how to use the technology in your alliances, in your work, in your communities, I'm happy to meet you there over lunch, coffee break, drinks after. I'm flexible. And I'll also be sharing a brochure which kind of goes over what I talked about today in a easier to access form. So without further ado, I will share my screen and we can begin. Right. Also, feel free at any point, raise your hand, ask a question. I'm happy to answer. Great. Jennifer, you can see my slideshow, correct?
Yep, we can see the slideshow.
Great. Right. So Ground News shares a lot of the same mission and vision as Brave Angels. We think that most Americans see the news as a force that divides us. And while it does have a huge presence in that, it also has a vital role in bridging that divide, which is why we're excited to partner with you all and provide leaders at Brave Angels with access to our highest tier to support your work in this election year. So what's Ground News? So Ground News is a Braver network partner and a news conversion platform home to over 50,000 news sources all across the world and political spectrum. So let me just bring this a bit. So by giving readers to a large variety of sources, we can help them stay well informed and see the full story. So Ground News is built by a small team of outsiders. We're not affiliated at all with any big tech platforms, corporations, big investors, where we are apolitical and we don't see ourselves as the arbiter of the truth. We are also not a fact checker, as we believe in empowering users instead of enabling them. Rather, we give you the tools to see the full side of the story and be well informed. Our vision is a positive coexistence where cooperative civil debate is norm, media is accountable, and critical thought is a baseline of our news, media, and info consumption. So this is our homepage. This is, if you go on Ground News, this is what our site looks like, and this is how you read news on Ground News. So as you can see, we cover a large variety of topics, mostly politics, but also some stuff like technology, culture, stuff that is adjacent to politics. For any story, you can see how it's being covered, who's covering it, and who's not covering it. So for example, for the story about Biden's speech on Ukraine, you can see how many news sources are covering the story, and out of those, how many lean left, how many lean right, how many lean center, and then you can read the coverage from each of the sources and get a broader view of what's happening from sources that may not share the same bias geopolitically or in the sense of US politics, how they may like lean left or right. And how we do this is we combine every article, every source who's covering any story, allowing folks to compare it. So let's say for the story about Trump's indictment last week, you could compare how every source in the world covered that story. And that story was massive. There was sources from Europe, from Asia, from Africa. It was a very widely covered story. And by using our service, you could compare how it's been covered so you could see a broader view of what's happening. So, for example, for this story, you can see how a source from the UK, The Guardian, is covering a story about air pollution, and then compare it to a source from France, kind of see how they're covering the story differently. This concept is called lateral reading. It's a topic that helps you compare the facts of the story that are not included and are included in a story, and also look at certain things like framing, bias, and loaded words. And for stories that are very important, like election, this can be pretty insidious. So this is an example of a story that was widely reported last year, for last election, about Russia's involvement in it. So as you can see on CNN, their coverage of it, if you just read this topic from CNN, you would think that Russia had an active role in meddling with election. However, on the right, if you read from Fox News, you might say like, oh, like what meddling? That never happened. So if you don't see the wide spectrum of what's happening, then you can have a biased view on how these big stories are reported and what the truth is, which is why the conversation around the election and its integrity can feel so toxic, and it's why the democracy is the biggest issue, or one of the biggest issues for this cycle. Because the thing is, these sources were both covering the same story, but by choosing and not choosing to omit certain facts, it can skew how the source is seen entirely. And this kind of leads into another part of the media that is a huge issue with how we stay informed. So if you read news on Facebook, on Twitter, on Reddit, on news apps like Google News, an algorithm is controlling what you see and why you see it, which can put us into these massive silos where we don't see stories that align with our worldview. But how we combat this is we don't really use algorithms on our platform. So it kind of harkens back to the day when you read the newspaper, so did your neighbor, so did your neighbor's neighbor, your friends, they all read the same newspaper. You kind of all had the same idea of what's happening. This is the same with ground news. If you're in Illinois and you're really into news about technology, or if you're in New York and you really care about news about finance, or you're left-leaning in California, or you're right-leaning in Texas, you will see the same homepage as everyone else. The idea of this is it keeps you from being influenced by algorithms that put so many Americans in an echo chamber of beliefs that they only conform to their likes and dislikes. So an example of this, and a term that we've coined, it's called a news blind spot. So a news blind spot refers to a story that isn't being covered by one side. So if you consume news on a platform, again, like Twitter or Reddit, you may have blind spots because your algorithm isn't showing you a certain topic because it thinks that you won't agree with it and you aren't likely to engage with that story. An example is of blind spots for left is there's a story about how 40% of Baltimore high school students didn't have a single student who was good at math. So if you lean right, if you lean left, you may not have seen that story, and that would influence your worldview towards how our students are being educated. Similarly, if you lean left, you may have not also seen the story about a massive increase in families who are crossing the border, which may impact your view on a hot topic like immigration. Conversely, on the right, you may not have seen a story about how Exxon in the 80s hid docs about the existence and problem of climate change, and you may not have also seen a story about gun control that may have went against that narrative. So the idea is if you consume news on these algorithm-driven feeds, you're just not seeing certain stories that are important for you to know and they can influence your worldview. And again, it's why having these conversations about these very polarizing topics can feel like occasionally you're talking to a brick wall because the person that you're speaking to may not be seeing the same news that you are.
Matt, can I ask a quick question on that slide?
Yep.
I just want to make sure I understand. So like on the left side there, on the one all the way on the left where blind spot, it says 0% on the left. That means 0% of the sources that you have on your platform were reporting on this if they're classified as stories on the left. And then, on the story on the right, the left side of the right there, it says 20% of the right. That means 20% of the news sources that are kind of labeled as sort of being on the right cover that story. Is that kind of what that means?
Mostly. So what the numbers mean is for all the stories. So for the Baltimore story, for example, 40%, sorry, there was 20 sources who covered the story. Out of those 20 sources, 0 lean left. So every source who's covering that story leaned right, which means there's some sort of political narrative that caused sources on the right to hop on that story because they felt that their reader base would engage with it, would care about it, would share it, would read it. And there's also, conversely, there's a thing of a story that caused sources on the left to not cover it, as they thought that like maybe this went against their like left-leaning readers' worldview, and they may not like it. So the idea there is you see on a story basis who's talking about the story and who isn't. That's kind of the idea of it, so you can get a broader view of what's happening.
Thank you.
No problem. So these ratings come from somewhere because the platform relies on us categorizing a news source as left or right, which is a very hard job to do. Thankfully, we have experts that do it. You may be familiar with All Sides. They're a partner of ours, and they provide us the ratings on sources. Same with Adfontes Media and Media Bias Fact Check. So two other media bias experts who rate the news sources that we have on a few factors. The first one is political bias. As you can see here, this is an example of the ratings. Some are predictable, like MSNBC leans left, not a huge surprise. Fox News leans left, not a huge surprise, but there is a lot of sources that are more local or that are more small that you may not know which way to lean. So this context helps you figure out, okay, this source that's reporting on the story, they had this political bias, so I should consider this bias when reading this news source. It also gives us a few more data points. One is factuality. I think fact checking is done pretty poorly in a lot of today's online world. It's kind of lost the trust of people who need it. And it isn't done in a very effective way because it relies on the experience of like one person and for like one article. So the way that we approach factuality is also from these expert media sites, Adfontes and Media Bias Fact Check. What they do is they look at the reporting history of a source and they evaluate for what they call good practices. Some of these are, if they make a mistake, do they correct it? And if they make a correction, is it visible? Do they put it on their homepage? Do they tuck it away under the comments? So they look at a history of this news source and how often they're following these like good practices. Again, like corrections, amount of biased words in their articles. When they do a retraction, do they just like hide it or do they make it clear? So again, this data is probably intuitive for most sources that you may know, like Reuters or Presswire. They're pretty reliable. That shouldn't be a huge surprise. But also there are sources that are international or more local or more opinionated where this data can come in handy. So example is if you're talking to a member of your community who's talking about a story, you can look in Ground News and see like, okay, the story is being covered by sources that are mostly low factual, which should give you pause when reading that story. Because if they have this history of poor reporting, there's a chance that the story itself may not be based in much fact. And these ratings aren't meant to be taken absolutely, where it's like every single source that, or every single article by a source that is middle to low factuality should be ignored, but they should be served as a point of caution. Yeah, question from Linda.
So for example, to read this chart, I'm looking at the very bottom row and it's RT. Is that like Russia Today?
Yes.
Okay, and so in that case, that bar, all those media outlets are low factuality. Tell me what that bar is. I don't understand what these three bars are exactly.
So it's a showing of, I think this is about 8 sources in this case. But if you go into any story on Ground News, we can go back here.
So I'm just trying to get to what do you mean by low factuality? It's at 3%. And so, yeah.
So low factuality refers to the news source's history of reporting. So if they have poor practices where like they have history of like publishing info that was proven false and then they didn't correct it, or if they did correct it, they didn't issue a retraction, or if they did issue a correction, they like hid it in the bottom of the page. So it takes a look at the past examples of reporting. Example is this story may be familiar to a few of you, but Rolling Stone a few years ago during COVID, they ran a story about how people were eating horse paste to cure COVID when Trump and Biden and a few members of the Congress kind of politicized the consumption of ivermectin. So Rolling Stone ran a story that said that gunshot victims at a hospital were being turned away because so many people were being hospitalized for ingesting this horse paste. The story was debunked because it was I think it was a rumor started by someone on Twitter, and Rolling Stone just didn't look into kind of the credibility of that source. And then after after it was proven that the story was false, they didn't really issue a retraction, and it wasn't very apparent the mistake that they made. So in that case, when Rolling Stone had that issue, that would ding their kind of factuality credibility. So that kind of stuff would put them in a lower rung of factuality, if that makes sense.
Okay, so going back to that other chart you had, the bottom line are those with the lowest factuality.
Yeah, like these are just an example. Like I think we have 50,000 sources on Ground News. So this is just a selection of a few just to like visualize examples. But how it works in practice is you can go on any Ground News story and then you can see in the same way that you can look at bias, you can see, okay, there are 20 sources covering the story. Out of those 20, 18 are low factuality. So it kind of gives some context where it's like, okay, if 90% of sources who cover the story are low factuality, I should be wary of what this story is saying.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. And Paul.
Just following up, so the 3 tiers of the chart, is there some particular order here? Is the bottom row the least factual then? Is that how we're to understand it?
Yeah. So this is the top one is high. This is just an example again. The middle one is mixed, and the bottom one is low. So this is it's just an example of some sources.
I assume you'll show us when we're reading an article of how we check that data, if as to a given piece and who published it.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Walk through that. Cool. And Tom.
Yeah, so what you're saying is, for example, that middle row has the Washington Post. So that's a little more than halfway credibility in terms of factuality.
Yes. So that means that the Washington Post has had some issues in the past for reporting, whether that be stories that turned out to be hoaxes that they didn't correct, or history of using a lot of loaded adverbs in their headlines, just like stuff that a good journalistic org shouldn't do.
Okay.
I can explain how this, or I can show how this works in a story basis. I was gonna go to the Ground News sites for a big story, and then I'll share that and then walk through that quickly. Let me just share my screen again. So this is an example of a story on the homepage. Let's see, a good story. So, story about Joni Ernst. Never trust a man who's eaten by cannibals. So let's look at the factuality for this story. Most sources who covered it were low factuality. Examples of those were Twitchy, WND, and the Gateway Pundit, which are all pretty major conservative news sources, who are more to like the far right end of the spectrum. So this factuality kind of gives context where it's like, okay, maybe I should look more into the credibility of these claims to see if they're being framed in a fair way, if they're being framed in an unfair way. So that's the kind of context that gives. And then you can also pull up the factuality bar, and you can see, okay, so out of the 9 sources that are covering the story, I can read coverage from sources that are more highly factual, like local ones like WSPCA, who's a local affiliate in Savannah, Georgia, or I can read coverage from sources who are more low factual, like let's say the Gateway Pundit, and then compare their coverage. So you could go into here, read their reporting, and then you could compare it with that from a source who is more low factual, like the Gateway Pundit. So again, kind of the idea is it just kind of gives context to pause and consider and say, can I trust the story? Can I trust the reporting? And then you go from there. We're not telling you that like this story should be ignored, but the context should be considered when reading it. I'll go back to my slideshow now. And then the last point that we give for context, which is actually done by us, is who owns the source. Ownership isn't as talked about of a bias factor as stuff like the left-right divide and factuality, but it is important. For example, if a source is owned by a corporation, that may influence their reporting, especially if their reporting can kind of counteract the business model of a corporation. Or there's even more deeper ones, like if the source is owned by government, of course, there is reason to believe that source may cover stuff and may ignore stuff that doesn't make the government look good. So we kind of get all this data and we show it for every story. We also allow you to look at what we call your news diet through tracking the stories you read and getting insights from your news diet, and do this tool called My News Bias. So how it works is it collects, again, info from the stories you read on the platform. You can see, okay, the stories that I'm reading, most of them are come from sources who are owned by media conglomerates. Most of the stories come from sources that are owned by government, so on and so forth. So you can see, so if you value that you want to support independent media, you can change your news diet to read more sources that are owned by sources that are more independent. So that's one thing that you can track. The other thing that you can track is countries. if you're interested in reading about more stories from Africa, which probably looking at my map, I should. I'm pretty focused on Canada, the US, Europe, and Eurasia. I'm also not reading anything about stories from South America. So even though I'm Canadian, I still feel like I get trapped a lot in a North American bubble. So this tool helps me see, okay, if I want to be a more worldly, more informed person, I gotta get better at reading sources from these areas. So it's a good tool if you want to expand your news diet and your worldview more geopolitically. We also track other stuff, like who owns the news you read again. So you can see, okay, most of the news I read may come from Nexstar, may come from News Corp, may come from Jeff Bezos if you read his media properties. And so you can see, okay, these sources are informing my news diet, and you can see if that's a positive thing. So if your top news story is The Hill, they're centrist, that's pretty good, that's fine. But if you unintentionally get a lot of news from a source that's more partisan, you may want to change that. Yep, Tom, question?
Yeah, you have a lot of icons here that don't have names on them. Is there a place where you can find out, who are they
Which
rather than just symbols?
icon, sorry, like these
For
sources?
example, number 4, number 3.
Oh, yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, so sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so we can know who that is.
Yeah, so if you hover over the sources on the actual site,
Oh, okay.
it will tell
It'll
you.
tell you.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So
Thanks.
if this is The Hill, Reuters, Voice of America, at CBC, that's like our kind of Canadian NPR. But yeah, if you hover over it, it'll tell you the name of the source and more info about it. We also track the article bias. Yep. Sorry, Cindy, question?
Hi, my name is Cindy. I'm in Maryland. Now and again, I read information about Chinese or Russian efforts to infiltrate the news with particular perspectives. Is there a mechanism in looking at the ownership of the news source that will indicate whether it is intended to inform or intended to influence?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's one that we don't answer directly, because we try not to be a platform that really tells people those kind of more subjective kind of things. But what we do have, which I can skip forward to, is so example here is actually from Russia Today, which is a Russian news source, which is associated with the government. So you can see when you see Russia Today on ground news, you can see, okay, like their bias is they lean a bit right. They have low factuality, and they're owned by the government of Russia. So the idea there is that even though a lot of us we're probably more involved in media and we're aware that Russia Today is a Russian government-owned news source, a lot of folks who aren't as media literate may not know this. So this tool is more meant for those who aren't as familiar with the media landscape to know that Russia Today is in fact owned by the government, and they do have a past history of reporting poorly. So while we don't say, hey, this story is meant to instruct rather than inform, we do give the context that the story is being covered by Russia Today, and they are Russian government owned, and they do have a history of poor reporting practices. So to answer your question, context, but we don't instruct people what's true and what's not.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Always. So yeah, and then a few more features for my news bias that may be helpful. Is called article bias. It can track which articles you read the most. So if you tend to read articles from the left or right, this will tell you that. This is my data. As you can see, I'm 3 times more likely to read sources from the left, which I might want to correct if I want to get a more full view of what's happening. And lastly, we have a feature that checks the blind spots that you read. So it'll tell you if you're reading more blind spots to the left or to the right, which can kind of give you an idea of if you're effectively seeing a lot of these stories that are reported more poorly. And then we also tell you the factuality breakdown of the sources that you read. So for this example, most of the sources I read are from sources that are high factual, but I do have about 10% that are mixed and about 5% that are low. So if reading from sources that has a good history of reporting is important to you, this story will kind of tell you, or sorry, this data point will tell you if you're doing a good job or not. The tool like this is more important to those who aren't that experienced in media and news, because they may be reading news from sources that aren't reliable without knowing it. So that really is the ideal user of this system. Yeah, Jennifer.
Will you save some time to kind of take us onto the site and show us like how do we kind of set this up, and like where do we look for the blind spots? How do we do like the news bias, just so we can kind of see like how to kind of do it on the site itself?
Yeah, for sure.
Great.
I can just go through this here and then I can go to that. So yeah, that's kind of an overview of the features and some ways that they can be used. As Jennifer alluded to, we're happy to offer access to the highest tier to everyone with the braveryangels.org email. I believe that includes Alliance co-chairs, state coordinators, volunteers, regional leads. If I missed any sort of group there, that's fine. As long as you have an @braveryangels.org email, you can access Ground News for free and all of the features that I just described. So I wanted to just talk briefly through how Ground News can be integrated into the Braver Angels Way through going to the convention and talking to partners and leads. I just wanted to walk through some ideas that might be helpful for your alliances and for you guys as leaders. One thing to consider also is the tool can be used in two ways. One is like to inform and challenge yourself more. So if you think, okay, I'm talking to members a lot and I feel like I'm just not knowledgeable on certain news or topics that like my members may be passionate about, this tool may be helpful for you personally to kind of get a deeper dive on these bigger issues. Cool. So one way which that can be done is through understanding other perspectives. Again, an example is if you want to understand a story from some point of view, you can go on Ground News, find a story that's related to the topic of which they care about, and really read reporting from both sides. So example is if you wanted to talk to someone in your alliance about climate change and how they're viewing that, it may be helpful to go into Ground News, find a story about climate change, and compare how sources with different biases are covering the story. Example here is the Daily Wire versus the Guardian. As you can see, they phrase it in that Trump promises to eliminate ridiculous climate mandates, versus Guardian frames it more as like Trump promises to retract laws for the nation. So if you read the reporting for both the sources, you can kind of get a good view of how blue may be perceiving certain issues about climate change and how red maybe seeing certain stories about climate change and kind of words that are used to describe stories within those beliefs. This can be used for alliances that are more centered around discussion, because it can give you kind of a jumping off point to talk about a story, to compare coverage, or really any programming that can compare from a nuanced understanding of a topic that's currently in the news. I just wanted to walk through a quick story and kind of example of how this can be used to depolarize. So I've been at Ground News ever since I was 18. I was actually Ground News' 5th employee back when I couldn't grow a beard and was in first year of school. Now I'm 25 and I can kind of grow a beard and I've done school. And now I'm here full time. So I've been here a while, seen a lot, met users, and kind of seen how we've changed lives in a pretty personal way. So one story is the story of Jason. Jason was a man, I believe he was in Georgia, and he started to have a strained relationship with his father. His father, just from seeing news in the Trump year that was a bit more partisan, he became more and more distant from him, and felt like he couldn't have a conversation with him. And he tried all kind of like different interventions and tactics, but he really couldn't get him to talk to him about issues that really bothered him in a more personal way. Example was he was very enamored in Breitbart, which is a source that's a bit on the right. And he tried doing things like, okay, like, read Huffington Post, read CNN, which are also partisan sources. But if you're deeply entrenched in one belief, you don't instinctually want to read other sources because it can kind of jarring, and it can be counter to your worldview. So he tried all these things, and eventually Jason came across us, and he gave his dad Ground News, and because we didn't say, hey, Jason's dad, the news sources that you read are terrible, read ones that are better. We didn't do that. All we did is we gave Jason's dad the sources that he liked, which was sources that are more partisan, and then gave him the ability to compare sources from across the spectrum. So in this case, instead of viewing these sources in isolation, he can see, okay, Breitbart's covering the story, but so is Reuters, and so is the Journal, so is National Review. So he can compare reporting from the sources that have a better history of coverage, and then through that become less polarized, because we weren't telling him this source is biased, it's bad. We just gave him easy access to other coverage. So kind of the lesson here is, if a person is deeply polarized because of the news they consume, instead of telling them, hey, read better sources, say, hey, read more sources. Because through that way, they can see themselves, okay, certain sources may use their language and some are not. So it's a way to kind of help people help themselves. So that's just one quick story of how it's been used in the past. And then again, if you think that the cause of someone's polarization is due to reading a lot of news on like Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, these like algorithm drive platforms, the blind spot feed may be a good antidote, because again, it implicitly bursts your bubble. For example, the kind of ramifications of COVID-19 haven't covered that well by a lot of sources on the left. But if you read the blind spot feed, you can see, okay, a story about Fauci admitting that the distancing wasn't based on science. You can see that story where you probably wouldn't see it in your like left-leaning news feed. So the idea is it allows you to kind of tackle that perspective and burst your bubble, which can help you if, again, your polarization may be derived from an algorithm that is polarizing. And lastly, I'll just go through this quickly, but Money's Bias is a tool, especially as a leader, if you're interested in maintaining a balanced news diet, it is helpful. It can give you an easier way to discuss a lot of issues that may be important to members in a more intelligent and nuanced way. So just quickly, how to redeem this. So this will also be in the brochure to send, so no need to like take notes now or take pictures of this. But to do this, you can do it in two ways. Ground News is an app and a site, but they both talk to each other, so you can use both or one. It's up to you if you prefer apps or reading news on your computer. So just simply go to the Ground News app, sign up with your Braver Angels email, create a password, go through the onboarding process. There is one bug here where we still offer you the free trial, even though we give you this access. So decline that. We don't want you to pay for it. It's free. So decline that. We'll send an email to your Braver Angels inbox, which will confirm that you are part of Braver Angels. And then go to that, hit verify, and then you'll have access to the entire platform. Similar thing on desktop if you prefer that. Go to ground.news slash register, enter your password, and then go through the process. Mostly the same deal. Again, this is all in the brochure that I can send after. If you already have an account, there's also instructions there, which are in the brochure, because I know that some people in Brave Angels are already on Ground News. Any questions all before I go into just a walk through the site and how kind of the features may work in a more practical way? Yes, Susan.
Hi, how do you handle advertising embedded in the news stories?
Yeah, good question. So we don't really block any ads at all. We want to support local sources and the media, so we fully respect paywalls of news sources. So if the local Times Courier wants to run an ad, we don't stop them, and then we fully give them that traffic. So we don't block any ads at all. Cool. And Dave?
Yeah, Matt. Hey, thanks. I really like what I'm seeing here. Two questions. One, the factual ratings. Those are looking backwards. They don't really comment at all, other than maybe probabilities on the factualness of a current story. Is that a good way of thinking about it?
Yeah, they are historical.
Okay.
But
That's fine.
but
And then my second question, so we complain about the algorithms on all the other sites, and here we seem to be relying very heavily on whatever process you guys have to determine if a source leans right or leans left, or they're factual or not factual. Could you talk to us about the quality control, how often you guys are looking at that? And who's checking the checkers to give us confidence that this is as good as it seems to be?
yeah, happy to answer that. So I can just go back to here for the ratings. Yeah, so for the news bias ratings, they all come from these three sources. We use these three because they're all pretty reliable, and they make their process public. So you can see, okay, for example, The Independent, which is a UK source. You could go on to All Sides, which is also a Braver network partner. You could go on to Ad Fontes, and you can see why the methodology of why they chose this rating for this source. So what they often look at is they look at like the sources that the headlines and how they're framed, the facts they did include, the facts they did include, certain adverbs that were used to describe a story. So that's kind of what the process looks like. And because these orgs themselves are like media watchdogs, there isn't really a watchdog for a watchdog. But there is, again, like they do make the process of evaluating the bias ratings for these sources public. So you can see why they chose rating for that source.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Great. And any other questions? No. Yep. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I have another question. Is
Yep.
there do you have a diverse political leaning on your staff at Ground News?
Yes. We are also pretty international. So myself, I'm in Toronto. A lot of our fellow employees are also in Toronto because Ground News is Canadian, but we also have employees who are in LA, who are in Chicago, who are in North Dakota, Texas, Milwaukee. So it's quite diverse in terms of geography. And also we have folks who are conservative, folks who are more centrist, who are more moderate. I think one thing about Ground News, because I grew up on Reddit, if you're familiar with the platform, and Reddit itself is quite a bubble. It's actually designed to be bubbles essentially. So like I grew up thinking like, oh, like, you don't want to vote for Bernie. Who are you? I was like one of those guys when I was like 18, 19. But after being here for a while, I kind of am forced to see all these new perspectives. So I feel like working Ground News is a pretty fast way to kind of get not turn it into a centrist, a person who's at least like open to seeing all these kind of points of view. But that being said, we do have people who are about conservatives, about liberals, about libertarians on the Ground News staff. So pretty balanced. Great. And V.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think what you've done is remarkable and great to see stories, that are out there in both the major presses and a variety of others side by side, so readers can really benefit from walking a mile in my news, as they say here at Braver
Okay.
Angels. They do that project. One area that I looked into was the blind spot section. I know there's, if you click on the blind spot from the homepage in the right corner, there's a page of blind spots to explore, and also a link to learn more about what that really means. And in it, I kind of felt like I wasn't necessarily being given a clear sense. So my initial impression, like just looking at the first page, is that blind spot means here's something that you might be missing if you're on the right or if you're on the left, because only the right is reporting it if you're on the left, or only the left is reporting it if you're on the right. Take a look at this stuff.
Mhm.
But it seems, and so one, I'm not sure if that's the focal intention. My impression is that maybe blind spot actually raises a variety of issues for a discerning reader to contemplate when looking at a story that's flagged as a blind spot story. And I'm not sure that as a first-time viewer of that section and reader of the explanation, that I'm confident that even as a kind of avid reader, that I'm confident in knowing what it means to be looking, what from your perspective, from how you're presenting it, what it means to be looking at a blind spot story. I might get the impression that a blind spot story is one that again, like I said, I might need to read up on so that I can complete my picture. But it might also be that this is a blind spot story because it's a politicized story and it's not as much of a story to be trusted. So I think I heard you comment on both of those things. So I just wanted to voice that kind of feeling that it didn't quite hit the mark for me personally. So if you want to bring that back to,
Yeah, I mean that's a fair critique, and one that I do agree with, where it's like not all blind spots are equal in a way.
right.
Like example is like do I really care what Majority Taylor Greene said about their Republican Party? Like, is a person who is leaning right, are they missing out much from not seeing that story? Probably not. But there is like some important stories which are unveiled in the blind spot feed. Let me find a good example of one. So let's see. So one thing here is should scroll down for a really good quality one. One thing maybe about the DEI statements at Harvard, where like this may be this story may be more substantive, because I'll click into it and I'll see that, okay, most sources are covering it. There is a higher portion of sources who are higher factuality. So this story may have more substantive reporting rather than just being like a hyper politicized, crazy person said this, or like very dumb thing happened in a way. So with blind spots, the important thing to consider is A, who's covering it? Are they reliable? Do they have a good history of reporting? And then base your kind of consideration off of that, where like this kind of gives cues whether or not you should care about it. Because I do agree where it's like some stories, there is politicized stories you don't need to know, but some are legitimately important stories.
Yeah. What you said is an interesting, snapshot. Maybe that could be your headliner or something like that. So higher up for the quick reader who's not necessarily digging in deeply to to think about what the implications of all this great data are that you pulled together.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's like, how does this affect your day to day in a way?
So if you can scroll down, Matt, it looks like when you click on a story over there on the right in the middle there is where you can see, oh, nope, scroll down a little bit further.
Here?
Yeah, right where your cursor is there. It sounds like that's where you can look very quickly. You click on a story, you can kind of look there and right there you can tell, is this a story where the people who are reporting on it are mostly decently factual, or if it's a story where the reporting that is happening is maybe higher of the low factuality. So you can just quickly kind of look there. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. You can look at the bar up here as well, right? So it's like half the sources that are covering this are mixed, which means it's like wishy-washy. And then almost 35% are high factuality, and then that leaves 15% that are low. So like I would trust this story because that has a decent amount of like reliable reporting. It does give some caution where it's like, okay, if I want to read this story from a source that has mixed factuality, I kind of want to give pause and consider that. But from a whole, this story does have pretty good reporting.
Wonder if I could follow up with one quick question on that.
Yep.
On the factuality thing, I think you said you had tens of thousands of sources that you're tracking. My hunch would be that despite, the wish that the independent media is, all about being objective and having journalistic integrity, many more of the sites that are likely to show up these days may look like someone's popular blog post versus an established news institution that's been around for a while, maybe it participates in, associations that require it to have certain journalistic ethics, lest it be, judged, biased by its peers and so forth. Wouldn't it also be possible that a lot of the sources you're covering might tend to be on the low factual? Like, is there a place where it says of the 50,000 that we cover, 10,000 are in the low factuality, 30,000 are in the middle, and 10,000 are in the high factuality? Because I would look at a story and maybe getting 35% who are highly factual is high given the pool that we're choosing from. I don't know if that's relevant or not.
Yeah, that's also a good question. Also, actually, a good idea for future because I didn't think to compare it to an average before. But yeah,
just something to bring back to your data team.
Yeah. I mean, like most sources on Ground News, like the bulk of the 50K are actually ones that are local. So it's instead of like it's like Joe Blow's blog, it's like you'll get like the Spokane Reporter versus
great.
or even sources where it's like we have sources who are in like rural India or somewhere in Slovenia. We have a lot of like local sources abroad,
Great.
which aren't as partisan, but there is. I think in the independent revolution, which is bad and good, there is some sources who are like have rose to prominence and they are independent, but they have pretty bad reporting because they are just more kind of blogs that kind of blew up. But if they do have some level of prominence, our data partners, all sides, at Fontes, Bias Fact Check would review them and would give context where it's like this is why you should or you shouldn't trust this source.
Matt, I'm just looking at the time when we're getting to sort of the top of the hour. And I wonder whether, I know for myself anyway, I need to kind of see the site and have, kind of watch your cursor, kind of take us to kind of how do we get to the blind spot? How do we get to like the setting up the My News thing? If you could just maybe walk us through some of that. I think that, I know that'd be helpful for me. Hopefully that'd be helpful for other people too.
Yeah, I can just go quickly here. Yeah, so here's the homepage. This story just represents the biggest one of the current moment, kind of like every other news homepage. This panel is the top stories, and then on the right, this is how you access the blind spot feed. So you can go view blind spot feed, it'll take you there. You can browse news blind spots. And then you also can go to My News Bias, which is the dashboard that has all of your data on it, about your news habits. It does crunch a lot of stuff, so it takes a while to load. But here you can see your news habits, as I mentioned before, like factuality, bias, so and so. So that's all there. It's also in your account page. If you go here, you'll have info like my news bias here. So there's a few ways of accessing it. Back here briefly. Yeah, so I see for Brave Angels, the biggest feature is just being the blind spot feed, my news bias, and kind of the context and curation that's present on every story. So if you just go into any story, you can see again data that I showed that I talked about before, which is like factuality, ownership. You can see who's covering the story. Okay, like most of this is owned by media conglomerates, so all the data is there for every source. But yeah, I think we're at time, so I'll just kind of put a pause there. But yeah, as a whole, I love your guys' work. I'm very excited for Kenosha. And I really do want to support whatever work is being done for election. I think kind of the past week with the Trump indictment and kind of the chaos of that has kind of woken at least me up for like how much work there is to do for this kind of cycle. And how many folks are still kind of in that us versus them mentality. So happy to help at all if anybody has any questions for usage, for how to integrate it into the service. I will quickly put in the chat a brochure, which has some info about like what I just talked about, my email, if anything comes up, and how to redeem the service. So I'll put that here. And then everyone can just take a look, and if any questions come up, please send me a message, and I'm happy to chat.
I just want to, if you have a few more minutes, does anybody have questions? Dave, I see has a question, anything that you're trying to think of that you haven't gotten answered and you're thinking about, how might I use this, in my state, in my alliance? I think we can take a few more questions, if you have those. Dave.
Yeah, this is more of a maybe a how-to question. Am I correct? We're going to get an email or something with links and directions to do all this. I heard earlier not to take pictures of things. How am I going to get access to it?
Yes, I believe Jennifer, we're going to send an email to the leaders. Is that correct?
Yeah, and you were going to put the link to the brochure, I think, because it's just all going to be on the brochure. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So I just sent a link in the chat, which has a link to how to redeem it, how it can be used, pretty much everything that I just said in this slideshow, but in a more concise and easy to read piece of info.
And Matt, can we get that maybe as like a PDF or something that I can then email out to everybody?
Yep.
Yep. So what I will do after this is I will send out an email, once I get that from Matt with the link to the recording and also the, kind of as an attachment to this document so that it's, easy to do. And it's pretty easy. I've signed up for it. So it's pretty easy to kind of sign up for membership. Does anybody else have questions about, as you're thinking about, how you might use this in your work in the field? Anybody else have questions?
Yeah. If not, again, I'll also be in Kenosha. So we can talk over in person, any experiences you're having or any questions. Yep. Cindy.
Hi, this is Cindy again.
Hello.
We have a Walk a Mile in My News workshop scheduled for July. And I can't imagine not offering Ground News as one of the resources for the participants to use to try to track through and cross-check stories. How can I do that without hitting a paywall or, they are members of the public at large, not necessarily Braver Angels members. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, so this Ground News is available to all. We paywall like certain features, but like the base level of usage for Ground News is free.
Okay.
So people like there's paywalls, like there is like you can only read like a certain amount of blind spots and certain data points in my news bias aren't available for everyone. So we do have the paywall somewhere.
Okay, Matt, when we get closer to the workshop, could I be in touch with you and make sure that what I'm suggesting folks do is actually appropriate? Would that be all right?
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because
Okay.
the base level, I met with Sulani about the Guacamole ML News, and the base level of the platform should be good enough for folks who just want to use the base like comparison blind spot features. So
Absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much. My name is Cindy. I'm with Central Maryland Braver Angels, and I'll be back in touch. Thank you, Matt.
yeah, no worries.
And so Matt, for a discussion alliance, if they know they're going to be having a discussion on a particular topic, they could sort of do a search underground news, kind of look through and get kind of some representative samples of stories from sort of across the spectrum, right? And then kind of share those with people to maybe look at before the discussion, something like that. Is that what you would recommend?
Yeah, like if a discussion alliance wanted to talk about, let's say like the Trump indictment, the leader could like almost like a doctor prescribe like, hey, we're seeing these like 3 big stories about like, an example could be like the event itself, and then Biden's reaction and then Trump's reaction. So members of the alliance could go into that source and then compare partisan sources who are covering each story and compare their reporting, and then kind of talk about it and then use that as basis to be better prepared for the discussion. Because like through that you should be able to see like, okay, a red may have these points, a blue may have these points, so you can almost like steel man the discussion before it even happens. So that's probably how I would handle a more discussion-based alliance. Yeah.
Great. Anybody else have questions before we finish up? All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Matt. This was super helpful. Really great to kind of have you walk us through and explain in detail, all of these different sort of features, and also all of the ways in which, Ground News figures things out, like where, what the reliability is and then factuality and all of that. So thank you so much for that. And thank you also for your offer to kind of, continue to support alliances when they have questions. We're all really grateful, and definitely will keep an eye out for you when we're in Kenosha. And I hope I will see many of you there. It's coming up soon, right? Just a few more weeks. So thank you all. Hope you have a good night, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thanks, Jen.
Great program, Jennifer. Thank you.
My
Thank you,
pleasure.
Matt. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks much.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
And Jennifer, I can send you the PDF just after this call, if that works.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And then I'll, takes a little while for the recording to be usable, but then I'll send that out, and that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Cool. And thanks again for putting all this together. I think it was a big effort on your behalf, getting all of this organized. So
Sorry it took me so long. It's my crazy busy life, but I'm glad we finally did it. And I think actually it was a good time, because it's, it's kind of, there's a little bit of a lull right before the convention, and then everybody's building up to, to that. So I think it actually turned out to be really, really nice timing.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, we'll talk
Awesome.
soon.
Yeah,
Yep.
for sure. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Jay. Nice to see you.